Welcome to Lesson 9 of the Story of Angels. In this lesson, we will be considering writings in the Bible from 60 to 90 in the first century CE. Gospel stories and teachings about angels. In our last lesson, we saw how the books of the Apocrypha advance the dualistic thought that had come into Judaism by way of the Persians. Now one must pray for good angels since there are also bad ones to consider under dualism. God is moved away from anything that might be evil, including death. God continues to be not only remote, but transcendent and only related to the good. Death is now the devil's domain. The early Old Testament texts that are not dualistic are therefore now examined with that dualistic good versus evil kind of thinking. And so the serpent of Genesis 3 must become Satan in that new interpretation, and that's what we found within the Apocrypha in Wisdom, the Book of Wisdom. We reviewed the non-canonical book of Enoch, which is outside of any part of the Bible. We saw that the reasons for it not being in the Bible are its inconsistencies and its contradictions and its unreliability. But we also saw its influence on its day and on the coming New Testament. Both angelology and demonology are greatly expanded here. This is the first recorded place that we read about the fiery place of punishment that is known as hell. There's more reinterpretation of older Old Testament texts that occur in the book of Enoch in light of dualism. But it's that whole dualistic thought world is greatly expanded in the book of Enoch and really sets us up for Christian theology of the New Testament. We looked in the last lesson at Jesus' birth narratives in Matthew and Luke. We discovered that there were differences between the two, and we also noted that angels still don't have wings when it comes to the New Testament. Today's topic then is to go beyond the birth narratives and get into the gospel stories and teachings about angels. Angels next appear in the gospel after Jesus' temptation. So let's turn to the book of Mark. Mark 1, the very first chapter of Mark. Matthew, Mark is the second book of the New Testament. Mark 1, verse 12. This dates from, the book of Mark dates from around 60 CE, which is about 30 years after Jesus' resurrection. Mark writes, "And the Spirit immediately drove him, Jesus, out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him." This is the shortest account of the temptation here in Mark. And Mark, for that matter, is also the shortest gospel. For that reason, it's thought to have been the very first gospel written, even though we have them in a different order in our Bibles. Matthew and Luke seem to have had a copy of Mark during their writing, took some stories out of Mark and expanded upon them. The idea is that the shorter version is likely the first version, whereas expanded versions will tell you about later writing. That's the thought here. The tempter here is Satan with a capital S, the angel accuser of the Old Testament, who used to be part of the heavenly court, if you remember, but he's now seen within that dualistic framework of good versus evil. So Satan, capital S, is the great opposer of God throughout the New Testament. The implication in verse 13 is that the tempting itself actually lasted all 40 days that Jesus was there in the wilderness. That differs from the three specific temptations that are given in Matthew and Luke. Mark also notes that the wilderness experience also included wild beasts. These may not just be ferocious animals like hyenas and jackals, but if you remember back in Lesson 8, we learned that the wilderness is where devils and evil spirits live, according to what we learned about Azazel from the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible. After the temptation, Mark says that the angels waited on Jesus, verse 13. That's, again, a traditional role for angels, helping, ministering. The Greek word for this is diakoneo, to minister to, or to minister, to serve. It's the root of the word, the English word deacon. Deacons are known as ministers of service. Well, let's look at this same story in Matthew. Matthew 4, go to the first book of the New Testament, Matthew 4, verse 1. Matthew 4, verse 1. Here's the expanded version of Mark's earlier short version. Matthew 4, verse 1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, and then follows the three temptations, which most of you know fairly well, and we're not going to read those. So jump down to verse 10. Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. That's Matthew's version expanding from Mark. Here's Luke's version. Let's look at Luke 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke 4. Luke 4, verse 1. Jesus, full of the Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. The three temptations follow, and then verse 13. When the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time. Here's a piece of art showing Jesus ministered to by angels by the French artist James Tissot from 1886 to 1894. Fascinating piece of art where Jesus is exhausted and resting, and the sheer number of angels who are there to minister to him is shown. So there were some differences between these three readings, if you recall them. In all three versions, it was the Spirit that drove Jesus into the wilderness. The story in all three versions is preceded by Jesus' baptism, and there Jesus is claimed by God as God's Son. That sonship is tested purposefully in the temptations. Again, dualism is in the background. The Son of God has come to defeat evil, and the first battle is right here in the wilderness. Both Matthew and Luke name the tempter as the devil, the Greek word diabolos, which is the Greek form of the Hebrew lesatan. In this case, diabolos carries more of that sense of false accuser or slanderer. Matthew refers to the devil also as Satan in verse 10. So the devil and Satan are equal in the New Testament and in Jesus' thinking, and therefore in Christian thinking. Matthew uses the same Greek word for angel ministrations as Mark, but it's interesting that Luke does not include angel ministrations at the end of his rendering of this story. It's odd for a writer who has so many angels in his birth narratives to not include an angel in this story, especially when Luke is using Mark to write his own gospel, and Mark has ministering angels. Luke would have had to purposely leave those ministering angels out if he had a full copy of Mark. How fascinating. Angels don't appear again in the Gospels until just before Jesus' betrayal, and it's only in Luke. So let's go back to Luke 22, verse 39. What's interesting here is that we're going to see a footnote that shows that not all ancient manuscripts include the verses that we're going to examine. Let's read from Luke 22, verse 39. He, meaning Jesus, came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Now notice there's a bracket in your text. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. End of bracket. The NRSV uses brackets to set off this area, and those two verses of 43 and 44. And there's a footnote that says, other ancient authorities lack verses 43 and 44. Scholars have debated for eons whether these two verses are really written in Luke's style or not, as to be able to tell whether they really belong there or not. Nonetheless, it's an angel. This is an angel from heaven, which is kind of an odd phrase, but this angel from heaven only shows up here in Luke. It's used once in Galatians 1:8. It's nowhere else in the entire Bible, this angel from heaven, as a phrase. And so that begins to allow scholars to question whether this is the writing of a different hand that's different from Luke, and therefore maybe this doesn't belong with the original. The angel then gives Jesus strength, similar to the angel ministrations in Matthew and Mark after the temptation, which seems again odd that it appears here. That ministration seems to appear here rather than after the temptation story for Luke. Maybe it's just kind of misplaced. But nonetheless, this is what we find in the text. Angels figure prominently in the resurrection narratives of all four Gospels. Let's take Mark as representative, since Mark is often thought to be the first of the Gospels, and then we'll note the differences between Mark and the rest of the Gospels. So Mark 16, verse 1. Mark 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, here is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Here is a rendering of the three Marys at the tomb with the angel that's woven into a tapestry, an Italian piece from the late 14th century. Done in linen with colored silks and metal thread. That's part of the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. In the empty tomb is a young man, says Mark, dressed in a white robe. Although Mark has used the term angel before, he doesn't use that term here, interestingly enough. This could mean that Mark is relying on an earlier written account of the passion and resurrection of Jesus. So he's telling the story as he received it, as it had been told before him. That's one possibility for that. But there are many associations in the Old Testament that identify such a man in white as an angel. There's the man in linen, who was a very special angel in Ezekiel 9 and in Daniel 10 and 12. There's the angel Raphael, who's appearing as a young man in Tobit 5:5. White is a favorite reference to heavenly types in apocalyptic writing. We saw God's clothing as white as snow in Daniel 7:9. We saw one of the horsemen clothed in white and brandishing weapons of gold, who appears after Maccabeus prayed for a good angel in 2 Maccabees 11:8. Jesus' clothes are dazzling white in the story of the Transfiguration, Mark 9:3. So you've got this idea that this brightness, this light is a holy light, is a holy white, if you will. Even in the other Gospels accounts of this Easter story, Matthew names this man as an angel of the Lord in Matthew 28:2. Matthew also shows this angel moving the stone away. And in Luke's version, Luke has two men in dazzling clothes in the empty tomb in Luke 24, verse 4. John's angel is, again, two angels in white sitting in the empty tomb in John 20, verse 12. But that comes after the earlier visit to the tomb by the disciples in 20, verses 3 to 10. These disciples don't see any angels at that part of the story. They just see the empty tomb. Nonetheless, all the angels do what is also typical of Old Testament angels in all of the gospel accounts of the resurrection. They calm the initial fears of those encountering angels. They explain God's actions. Jesus has been raised, and they give instructions on what to do next, just as we saw angels doing all the way through the whole Old Testament narrative. Like the two birth narratives, the four resurrection narratives are very different one from another. Why would this be so? Well, Jesus' ministry from baptism through crucifixion had many eyewitnesses, especially the 12 apostles, who Jesus was training for ministry. These apostles become the preachers of the story of Jesus. These witnesses were not, however, present at Jesus' birth. Now, one could suggest that Mary and Joseph were witnesses and therefore could have shared their stories with Matthew and Luke. But that is not likely, since Matthew has them both in Bethlehem and Luke has them both in Nazareth. Says Raymond Brown again, the birth stories differ from the New Testament accounts of Jesus' ministry and death, where known eyewitnesses, the apostles, are presented as the sources of the traditional preaching embodied in the Gospels and the book of Acts. Some may object that Matthew and Luke surely got their information about Jesus' birth from his parents, yet that is never claimed in the New Testament, nor in the earliest church writings. And the great difference between the two Gospels' birth stories causes difficulty for that solution. The situation is somewhat similar in the four resurrection narratives. The stories we have do not necessarily capture the moment of resurrection. In other words, there was no eyewitness to the moment of Jesus awaking from death and resurrecting. The stories instead tell the result of that resurrection, the empty tomb, and the appearances following the resurrection appearances. Again, Raymond Brown writing on this subject. The real explanation of why the tomb was empty would have become apparent only after Jesus had appeared to his disciples. Jesus could appear because God had acted and had raised him from the tomb, and the tomb was empty because Jesus was alive and had been taken to God. In order for Christians to develop a narrative of the empty tomb that they could pass on, they had to include the explanation as part of the story. And the way to do this was suggested by the patterns of apocalyptic literature, a literature that dealt with explaining God's eschatological mysteries. In other words, mysteries about the last times. An angel or angels could be supplied to interpret the emptiness of the tomb so that the story could now have a preaching function, Raymond Brown says. And therefore, it's to understand that both the birth narratives and the resurrection narratives are constructions by the authors of these particular four Gospels. They are not biography. What they are Christological theology. They are theology about Christ. They are constructions of the author Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each author has an eye to his purpose, place, and audience, just like all the books of the Old Testament and all the books of the New Testament, whose authors have an eye to purpose, place, and audience. It's similar in function to the two creation stories that I mentioned earlier from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Each gospel narrative tells the story with a different emphasis and a different nuance. That doesn't mean that they are fictions. These constructions tell important truths about Jesus and who he was and how God acted through him. Their confluence on so many main points is truly inspiration, and that's what's remarkable about these stories. These are authors in different times and different places. They are not, in general, looking at each other's material, with the exception possibly of Mark's material being available to Matthew and Luke. For two of them to come together, Matthew and Luke, to come together on the virginal conception by the Holy Spirit without knowing each other, without seeing each other's writing, is wholly remarkable and wholly inspirational. So each author of the Gospels tells us important truths in their Gospels. How Jesus was the Son of God, how Jesus was both human and divine and born of the Holy Spirit, how Jesus was born among the Jewish poor, as in the shepherd's narrative, how Jesus was hailed even by Gentiles, as in the Magi narrative, how Jesus would unite all through his death and resurrection. And to explain all this in each construction are angels, the great explainers of the Old Testament, the great explainers of apocalyptic. This helps us also to understand that the Gospels in general are not biography. Their purpose is not history. Their purpose is to teach and preach Jesus as the Messiah. Mark 1 verse 1 says this: "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." That's a preaching. That opening is a preaching and a teaching. It is not a biography, nor the opening of a biography. And the closing of John's Gospel, chapter 20, verses 30-31. "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these were written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." That's preaching. That's preaching and teaching. That's not biography. It's about creating faith that you may come to believe. That's why these Gospels were written. That then helps to explain both the similarities and the differences between the Gospels. Each author took information about Jesus that this author had received and ordered it according to his purpose. He left out some, he expanded some, he added others, even changed the locations of some events that are different from other of the Gospels. And yet, taken together, each Gospel tells a truth about Jesus. These are truths to be understood and cherished. One final note about the Gospel stories: we haven't seen wings anywhere on angels. It would seem that the stories that the Gospel writers have employed have accepted the tradition of the Old Testament, in which angels have no wings. Otherwise, these angels do what they always did in the Old Testament in terms of being messengers, being helpers, being guardians, all of those kinds of things. What then did Jesus believe and teach about angels? Well, let's review that before we entirely leave the Gospels. Jesus taught that angels were guardians, including of children. Let's look at Matthew 18. Matthew 18, verse 10. Matthew 18, verse 10. Matthew writes, and Jesus is speaking, "Take care that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you, in heaven their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven. Psalm 91 speaks of angel guardianship. The story of Tobit in the Apocrypha shows these angels bringing concerns to God. Matthew goes on to relate the parable of the lost sheep. Luke tells the same parable, then adds the parable of the lost coin, and ends both of them in this way. Let's look at Luke 15. Luke 15, Matthew, Mark, Luke 15, verse 10. Matthew, Mark, Luke 15, verse 10. Jesus again says, "Just so I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." In other words, angel guardianship includes concern for our welfare from the youngest of our age. Jesus most often teaches about angels in relation to the end times. Look at Mark. Go back one book to Mark 13. Mark 13, verse 24. Jesus again is speaking. "But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." Jump down to verse 30. Verse 30. "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father." Here's a wonderful painting by Michelangelo that's on the wall behind the altar in the Sistine Chapel. And this is only a part of it. This is detail from the great Last Judgment, where you see Jesus in the center coming on the clouds, and angels up at the top and in various places, but no wings. You notice there are no wings anywhere. This is fully formed apocalyptic. This is apocalyptic, in which expectations of doom and conflict are going to occur before the end of time. The Son of Man, who is the Messiah, is the mighty conqueror of God. That's a part of all apocalyptic, that there is this mighty conqueror of God. And in the New Testament, that is the Messiah, the Son of Man. The background here is Daniel 7 and Zechariah 2, which we read. There are parallel teachings about this in Matthew 24 and 25, and also in Luke 21. We see the Son of Man comes in clouds in this rendering by Mark in verse 26. Daniel's vision has the Son of Man coming with clouds in Daniel 7:13. It connects with God who rides upon clouds in Psalm 68 and Psalm 104. And coming with great power and glory, that being given by God. In Mark 14:62, the Son is seated at the right hand of power. Matthew 26 picks that up also. The Son of Man is seated at the right hand of power, meaning at the right hand of God. With the coming of the end comes judgment. The angels will gather all from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Verse 27, which means both human and angelic and heavenly types are going to be in this judgment and judged, it would seem. Here we see echoes of Enoch occurring right here in the Gospels. More on judgment and angels in Matthew 13. Go back to Matthew 13. This is Jesus' explanation of the parable of the weeds in the wheat. Matthew 13. Matthew 13, 37. Go down to 37. He, Jesus, answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." This passage appears only in Matthew. This is a judgment of the good and the bad coming straight out of apocalyptic of the late Old Testament and the Apocrypha. Jesus always tends to link the Son of Man with angels. Every reference to Jesus, Son of Man, also has angels in the reference, it seems. Even in John's Gospel, where there are scant references to angels, we see something like this. So look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John 1. We're going to go to John 1. First chapter of John, verse 50. Verse 50. This is the call of Nathanael to be a disciple. Verse 50. Jesus answered Nathanael, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." So even John tends to link angels with Jesus' references to the Son of Man. This one here particularly reminds us of Jacob's ladder or Jacob's stairway that we saw way back in Genesis 28. But it also illustrates Jesus' view of angels with the Son of Man. These coming on clouds passages are known as references to Jesus' second coming. Jesus' first coming was as a baby in Bethlehem. Now that he has ascended, the second coming will occur at the end of time. Jesus, as the Son of Man, always has a sense of closeness with angels that likely derives from those occasion of angel ministrations that we already saw in the scriptures, and from the expectations of the end times as cited in the apocryphal works that I mentioned. It's derived from Old Testament books like Daniel. That there's a closeness that's there. And even that closeness is stated emphatically at the time of his arrest. Go back to Matthew, the end of Matthew 26, at the time of Jesus' arrest. 26, verse 48. 26, verse 48. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled which say it must happen in this way? Clearly, Jesus has belief in angels, and that belief in angels is unwavering. One final teaching that Jesus has on angels comes in the parable of Jesus in the book of Luke, Luke 16. Luke 16, verse 19. Luke 16, verse 19. Jesus says, "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us.'" The parable continues, but we're going to stop here to look closely at several elements that become important for our story on angels. First, the poor man dies and is carried away by the angels, it says in verse 22. The poor man dies and is carried away by the angels. That's the first time we've seen an association of angels with those who die. That this is a job for the angels to carry off those who die to the heavenly places. That would seem to continue the idea of guardianship right on into the afterlife. Martin Luther once said, "At death I know not where I am to go, but my guides, the holy angels, know it well." The sculpture behind me illustrates this new idea. It is a bronze piece after the French artist Antonin Mercier called Gloria Victis, or Glory to the Vanquished, done in 1874 in France. It portrays an angel taking a slain soldier from the battlefield. He is nude, just like the people in Michelangelo's Last Judgment were nude, because in death we leave all behind. This is quite a moving piece of art of an angel carrying the dead to glory. Where do the angels carry Lazarus in this parable of Jesus? To be with Abraham, it says in verse 22. That meaning intended here is likely heaven. But if you remember, in the Old Testament, all people went to Sheol, the place of the dead. Subsequent verses here indicate that this is a place of reward when compared to where the rich man is, which is a place of torment. So we're not really talking about Sheol here, where Abraham is. We're not talking about Sheol as it was known and conceived in the Old Testament. Hades, the word Hades that Jesus uses within this parable, is somewhat of a surprising choice of words in verse 3. The Hebrew Sheol was translated as Hades in the Greek Septuagint, meaning that the place of the dead, this place of no condemnation, the place where all good and bad went, was known in Hebrew as Sheol and known in Greek as Hades. There was no punishment in Sheol. There were no flames and torment in Sheol. So Jesus here is clearly using Hades interchangeably with the word hell that rises up in books like the Book of Enoch. As part of his teaching. This too represents something of a new element in the progression of New Testament thinking. Not surprisingly, angels ushering the dead into heaven comes into our liturgies and is still found with us today. For example, in the prayers that are said at a funeral vigil, may the angels surround them and the saints welcome them in peace, it says in the Book of Common Prayer from 1979. Or at the end of the funeral rite, as the body is borne from the church, into paradise may the angels lead you. At your coming may the martyrs receive you and bring you into the holy city, Jerusalem. Jesus adds to the idea of resurrection in an exchange with the Sadducees elsewhere in the Gospels. Who were the Sadducees? They were an aristocratic and priestly segment of Jewish rabbis of Jesus' day. Religiously, they are more conservative than the Pharisees. The Sadducees believed in only what could be found in the Torah, namely Genesis, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. They did not believe in the resurrection because it was a new idea. And these being more conservative among Jews, they did not fathom new ideas. And yet, they asked Jesus a trick question about the resurrection in Mark 12. Let's look at that passage. Mark 12, verse 24. They asked Jesus a trick question, and there in the early verses, they describe a situation that they make up in which a woman marries a man who dies, and then she's given to his brother to marry him, and then he dies, and successively through several husbands, and then she dies. And so they basically ask the question that in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Jesus knows this is a trick question, and he answers them in verse 24, Mark 12, 24. Jesus said to them, "Is not this the reason you are wrong, that you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the story about the bush, how God said to them, 'I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob'? He is God not of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong." Those who are resurrected, Jesus just said in that reply, are like angels in heaven. Now note there, the resurrected don't become angels in heaven. Some people have thought that. No, the resurrected don't become angels. They are like angels. In other words, they are spiritual. They are pure. They are immortal. They are happy. They are blessed like angels. Remember, all the way back to the beginning of the first lesson, we learned that angels are a separate order of creation from humans. Both the heavens and the earth are created by God, but these are separate orders of creation. Jesus also points out to these tricky Sadducees that marriage is an order of this world, not the next. Clearly, Jesus believes in the idea of the resurrection, even as it comes out of Daniel 12. Even if it is a relatively new concept from the very late Old Testament, Daniel being the last book written in the Old Testament, Jesus sees it connecting with the God of the living, not the dead, in Exodus 3. And he says that. It's interesting that he goes back to the Torah, which is the only part of the scriptures that the Sadducees believe in, to quote from Exodus 3. Jesus' answer to the disbelieving Sadducees actually also includes an answer regarding angels. What's funny here is that the Sadducees didn't believe in angels either, according to Acts 23, verse 8. Does Jesus have a sense of humor? Yep. What did Jesus think of Satan? If we're going to be dealing with dualism within the New Testament, we must go to that other extreme. What did Jesus think of Satan? Luke 9. Let's look at several verses in a row here. Luke 9. Luke 9, verse 1 and 2. Luke 9, verse 1. Then Jesus called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. Luke 10, verse 1, Jesus sends 70 more with the same authority. It says, after this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. He said to them, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out the laborers into his harvest. Go down then to verse 17, when we see the report of the 70 coming back to Jesus. Verse 17. The 70 returned with joy, saying, Lord, in your name even the demons submit to us. He said to them, I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning. See, I have given you authority to tread on snakes and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice at this, that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Here is an interesting piece of art called The Fallen Angel by Alexander Cabanel from 1847, a French artist. You notice he's picked up the idea that angels are inherently beautiful, but there is that evil quality that comes out. And certainly the wings are portrayed there, which we know were not part of biblical angels or even demons for that matter. But the ominousness is there. It's a fascinating piece of art. The Fallen Angel. Jesus reflects then that late Old Testament idea of Satan being thrown out of heaven. But he's not locked up yet. That's part of what we began to see when we got into the Apocrypha. He's not locked up yet. He still has influences on humanity. Let's look at John 8, the Gospel of John 8. John 8, verse 44, where Jesus is speaking to those who refuse to believe. You are from your father the devil, and you chose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. The devil as a murderer from the beginning. Here Jesus is associating Satan with the serpent in Genesis 3, just as we found in the book of wisdom in the Apocrypha. Jesus expounds on the serpent's words as lies for the purpose of tempting. That's what the tempter in the temptation story is about to do, is promoting lies for the purpose of tempting. The fall of humanity in sin brought death, according to Genesis 2, verse 17, and that makes the devil both a liar and a murderer, according to Jesus, who's pulling all of this in his own reinterpretation out of Genesis 2 and 3. Jesus also refers to him as the evil one. You remember in his giving of the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:13, but rescue us from the evil one, not just deliver us from evil, but from the evil one. Jesus also calls the devil the ruler of this world in John 12. Why? Because of all the sin that is spread around. He's doing the spreading. If there is evil, then it is all Satan's doing. That's part of dualism. Just as it was all of Azael's doing in Enoch 10. And he's under Satan, according to Enoch 54. This is dualism. That's the thinking as the ruler of this world. Let's look at John 12. While we're in the book of John, look at John 12. Verse 31. John 12, verse 31. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. In other words, Jesus will defeat Satan through the cross. Jesus will defeat Satan through the cross. This is the ultimate battle of good and evil. And that final battle is there at the cross. Only at the last judgment will Satan finally be imprisoned. We'll read about that in Matthew 25. Go back to the book of Matthew, nearly at the end. Matthew 25, verse 41. Matthew 25, verse 41. Jesus says, then he, the king, meaning the king or the judge, then he will say to those at his left hand, you that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Notice that hell was not prepared for sinners. Hell was prepared for the devil and his angels, even as it is stated in Enoch 10 and 21. It's not part of the Old Testament, but that's exactly what we heard and read together in Enoch 10 and 21. So what have we learned from this lesson about angels and demons in the gospel? First, we've learned that angels continue to do their mission as outlined in the early Old Testament, and they do so without wings. Second, to this is added the idea that angels escort the dead to heaven. Thirdly, Jesus teaches about angel guardianship and their role in his second coming at the end of time. And fourthly, Jesus accepts all the interpretations or the reinterpretations regarding Satan, his role and his fall from late apocalyptic, including from the book of Enoch, the non-canonical book of Enoch. That's where we'll end for this lesson. In the next lesson, the final lesson of the series, Angels Beyond the Gospels in the New Testament. Our closing prayer for this lesson is the prayer for church musicians and artists as found in the Book of Common Prayer 1979. Let us pray. O God, whom saints and angels delight to worship in heaven, be ever present with your servants who seek through art and music to perfect the praises offered by your people on earth, and grant to them even now glimpses of your beauty, and make them worthy at length to behold it unveiled for everyone. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.